Hello and welcome back to this second panel in our conference on the state of the Constitution, organised by the Constitution Unit at University College London in partnership with the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, the Oxford Constitutional Studies Forum and the UK in a Changing Europe. I'm Alan Rennick, Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit, and I'll be chairing this panel on Northern Ireland, how can power sharing be revived? Northern Ireland, as you'll be aware, finds itself again without a functioning executive or assembly, and the risks of a longer-term breakdown of devolved government appear severe. Disagreements around the protocol have, of course, caused great tensions, but there are also questions over whether the provisions of the 1998 Belfast Good Friday Agreement remain fit for purpose as they approach their 25th anniversary. And for an event about Northern Ireland hosted in London, there are particular questions about what role the UK government and indeed other actors based in Great Britain should play in seeking a healthy outcome. We're joined by a wonderful panel to discuss these issues. Julian Smith has been the Conservative MP for Skipton and Ripon since 2010. Having been Chief Whip under Theresa May, he was made Secretary of State for Northern Ireland by Boris Johnson in July 2019, and he was central to the restoration of the power sharing institutions through the New Decade New Approach Agreement in January 2020. The Prime Minister relieved him of his post just a month after that agreement, but despite his short tenure of just over 6 months, the respect in which he's held across all parts of Northern Ireland's political community is frankly extraordinary. Dr. Mary Murphy holds a Jean Monnet Chair in European Integration and is Senior Lecturer in Politics in the Department of Government and Politics at University College Cork. She's a widely respected expert on both the EU and Northern Ireland. Indeed, while many of us have felt the need to understand better the nexus between the EU and Northern Ireland in the last few years, Mary has been well ahead of the game. Her first book, Northern Ireland and the European Union, The Dynamics of a Changing Relationship, was published in 2014, and her latest book, co-authored with John Evershed, A Troubled Constitutional Future, Northern Ireland After Brexit, was published by Agenda earlier this year. Dr. Clare Rice is a research associate at the University of Liverpool, working on its project Beyond Unionism and Nationalism in Northern Ireland. She has researched the operation of Northern Ireland's devolved institutions, the New Decade New Approach deal, and the protocol. And she's also a widely respected analyst of Northern Ireland affairs, appearing regularly on television, radio, Slugger O'Toole, and many other outlets. And finally, Alan Weissel was a senior civil servant in the UK's Northern Ireland office. He worked for many years on the peace process, including on the negotiation of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement of 1998. He retired in 2015 and is now an honorary senior research associate here at the Constitution Unit. His unit report on the mechanics of a so-called border poll, published in 2019, led to the creation of the Working Group on Unification Referendums on the Island of Ireland, which reported last year. And last month, he published a further report, Northern Ireland's Political Future, which examines the difficulties now facing Northern Ireland and how power sharing might be restored. Thank you so much, Julian, Mary, Claire, and Alan, for joining us this afternoon. 4 speakers will speak in the order I've just introduced them for about 5 minutes each. After that, we'll move to discussion among the panel, and then we'll open it out to Q&A with you, the audience. So please be ready with your questions. You can submit them at any time. If you have a question, please write it into the Q&A function as opposed to the chat. Connor Kelly, our Q&A facilitator, will select from among the questions and read them out. Please note that as a default, Connor will read out the names of those who ask each question. If you prefer to remain anonymous, please indicate this when you submit your question. And as you'll have noticed, the whole event, including the Q&A, is being recorded. We'll post it online on our website and our YouTube channel, and it'll also become a Constitution Unit podcast. So you might want to bear that in mind when deciding whether to ask your question anonymously. More than enough from me. I shall pass straight on to our first speaker, who is Julian Smith.
Well, thank you, Alan, and it's great to be here. Thank you to UCL for hosting and also for your opening remarks and kind remarks about me. I remain confident that power sharing can be restored again fairly soon. I think probably not immediately. It's obviously going through, or Stormont's going through, and the situation with the protocol and Stormont going through high turbulence at the moment. I'm not going to, for a variety of reasons, talk about the sources of that turbulence. But what I want to kind of focus on is my confidence that the politicians at Stormont, the parties at Stormont, do want to get back into power sharing. I think all of the parties believe that this is the best way to govern Northern Ireland. And immediately after the election, I was making the case that there needed to be rapid Stormont talks and a rapid focus on dealing with the protocol. And I think that assessment still remains. As you'll know, there's the new head of the civil service, Jane Brady, who's excellent, is having regular discussions about a programme for government with the political parties. So that work is ongoing. But I think now there needs to be a big focus on the protocol, which for unionists and for the DUP is causing such challenges. I don't think it's particularly worth going through how we've arrived at that point. There are obviously some real issues with the protocol. We can have a debate about whether those should have been made quite as strongly as they have been, but those issues are there. The polling is showing that the DUP and its base is, really the base of unionism does feel these issues are significant. So I think the biggest challenge is how do we get and motivate the particular EU to give us the flexibilities needed to actually address the concerns that unionism has. And that's obviously difficult because the EU feels it's signed up to an agreement, which it has with the UK, and now there are changes sought. But I guess I would like to stress that the EU has played a really important part through both funds and commitment, along with many other stakeholders in Northern Ireland's success. And we do need to somehow find a way of getting them to shift to address the concerns of unionism, because I think that is really the main stumbling block on Stormont now. If we can get those changes to the protocol that Jeffrey Donaldson can then sell to his base, I think we can get Stormont moving pretty quickly. The UK government's role in that is obviously key. Ultimately, it will need to decide what is a good deal or not, and ultimately it will have to be strategic about how it gets the EU to make those changes, because obviously at the moment it looks as if the EU is not particularly motivated to shift too far. One of the things the UK government can offer on other files in other areas, how can it get that trust going again with the EU, and I think that is going to be a key. Because whilst I say we need to address the issues of unionism, it ultimately it's an international agreement, and the UK government will need to make a call. And I think the key thing here is to try to get these negotiations moved on fairly soon. Obviously, we're entering the July season for unionism. The received wisdom is nothing's going to happen at the moment, but I would argue we should be still out there, and particularly with the EU, working through how do we get a political arrangement here which solves many of the issues that are presented. Your question is implied other issues around GFA. As I wrote immediately after the election earlier this year in Northern Ireland, I don't think any of those issues can be addressed now. I think we need to doing any changes, amendments in flight is nuts. It's doomed to failure. What we have to do is get Stormont back up and running, get the programme for government and the priority on NI voters, and then, as we enter the 25th year of the GFA, maybe there are issues that need to be addressed, but they do need to be addressed, I think, in the fullness of time, if needed, and not in the aftermath of an election.
Thank you so much. You've touched upon many of the key issues that we'll explore in further depth over the next hour or so. Mary,
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you to the Constitution Unit as well for the invitation to speak this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to join you. Well, let me start by saying that I do share some of Julian Smith's optimism in relation to the revival of the power sharing arrangements in Northern Ireland. And when I was thinking about this question, there was 3 words really that came to mind. And those 3 words are dialogue in the first instance, agreement in the second instance, and then deadline in the third instance. So let me just speak very briefly to each of those 3 key words. And the first is dialogue. In Northern Ireland right now, the whole dialogue process is much more complex because there are different strands of dialogue which are currently in the mix. So on the one hand, we have UK-EU dialogue on the protocol, which is effectively stalled as we understand it, complicated by the British government legislation disapplying the protocol, and also made very difficult because of the absence of trust between the EU and the UK. On the other hand, and again, as Julian referred to there are actually internal discussions and dialogue taking place in Northern Ireland right now. These are primarily around the programme for government. They've been convened by the head of the civil service in Northern Ireland. And there's some signs for optimism here because the arrangement is that there will be a meeting every 2 weeks in a process which is about planning for a future executive. Now, on the issue of agreement, how do you get from dialogue to an agreement? Well, if we look at previous episodes of suspension or collapse, they effectively were ended, or they were followed by extensive and intensive dialogue, which often resulted in an agreement, not always, but often produced an agreement, and in some cases a document. So in 2007, we saw the St. Andrews Agreement effectively end or restore the Northern Ireland institutions. We saw it again in 2020 with the New Decade, New Approach document. Now, again, in this instance, the situation is different and it's complex because the current key dialogue relates to an international agreement between the UK and the EU. And they are signatories to that agreement, but of course it applies specifically to Northern Ireland. Now, I would suggest that there is some basis, it's limited, but there is some basis for to some extent, de-dramatizing those discussions around the protocol. You know, there are concerns about its implementation. Most of those who are involved in and around the European Union, at least, and within Northern Ireland itself, suggest that those concerns are not insurmountable. I think it's important to acknowledge that in some cases, those concerns are reasonable. And even those who support the protocol are calling for British government engagement with the EU to smooth out its implementation. So across the board, there is some basis for finding an agreement. Now, again, it's instructive to look back here and to think about the factors which were important in terms of overcoming other impasses in Northern Ireland. And the big factor that's always been important is leadership. That's invariably been British and Irish government leadership in the past. In relation to the protocol, of course, the EU is a player here, and we have seen a loss of trust between all of these individual actors, which is highly problematic, but it does need to be fixed. The second issue that's always been important in terms of overcoming impasse in the past has been choreography. And here I'm talking about things like timing, like sequencing, like packaging, like framing. All of these can be a means to establish trust. And they can also allow a party or parties to prepare their respective constituencies for possible compromise. Beyond that, I've always been of the view that if there's a problem in Northern Ireland or a problem about Northern Ireland, it's best addressed in Northern Ireland by its political leadership, first and foremost. Imposing agreements, particularly when they're not informed or they're not influenced by all of the parties in Northern Ireland, is really highly undesirable. And frankly, it's often unworkable as well, because they just don't command the kind of legitimacy that's necessary to make them acceptable. The current bi-weekly talks in Stormont, I think, are worth considering. There is capacity within those talks to talk about a possible future programme for government. If you're talking about a possible future for government, there are issues like international relations and internationalisation that are part of that discussion and dialogue. It's been a feature of previous Northern Ireland programmes for government. It's certainly something which the Scots and the Welsh have developed much more extensively and comprehensively. So this forum could usefully be an avenue for discussion and dialogue, which might lead to some form of agreement and which might then feed back to the British government. And I've ended that sentence with a ... here in my notes. So I'll leave it at that. The final point is in relation to the deadline, just very briefly. I mean, again, I agree with Julian Smith here, despite the urgency around all of this, I'm really not sure that any of this can necessarily happen quickly, because the rebuilding of trust, to coin a phrase, is a process rather than an event. Northern Ireland has also had a tendency to treat deadlines with a degree of abandon in the past. But when there are repercussions in terms of missing deadlines, political agreement can result and can evolve. Now, it's a some way off, but the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement in April 2023 is a very significant date, needless to say. If the Northern Ireland institutions are not up and running by then, well, then other constitutional options may well gather momentum. And I think that deadline alone should be a very important factor in terms of forcing minds in Northern Ireland and beyond.
Thank you so much, Mary. Tantalising thought at the end there that we might explore further. Clare, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alan, and thank you to the team at the Constitution Unit for the invitation to contribute to this panel today. I guess whenever we were first asked to prepare a few minutes of reflections or thoughts on the topic being discussed today, on how power sharing in Northern Ireland can be revived, my initial thinking went in a couple of different directions. The first one was in relation to the, I guess, modalities and the practicalities related to the word how within this question, and in contemplating how we get from the point we're at currently to a point where we have at the very least a functioning assembly and executive. The second part then was a little bit more abstract, but I think no less important. Indeed, it has been touched upon in the two previous reflections we've had so far, and that was in focusing on the term power sharing within the question, and whether or not power sharing as we know it and have known it to date here is the same type or model of power sharing that we're talking about when we're thinking of what reviving means in real terms. So when we talk about reviving power sharing, are we reflecting simply on getting things back functioning as a shorter term aim, or are we talking about doing this in a more pragmatic way that will aim to withstand longer term pressures and inevitable knocks in the future? If I follow the first line of thought, the simple answer is that there really is no easy way to meet all of the existing interests and demands surrounding the restoration of the institutions here currently. So much of the situation, as we've already heard, is playing out essentially feeding off external factors that are quite simply beyond the powers of the parties or politicians in Northern Ireland to be able to enact any real sort of change. The Northern Ireland Protocol is at the centre, indeed, of why we don't currently have an assembly or an executive in place. It's been a key factor as well as to why the Democratic Unionist Party, so the party at the centre of the political situation here at the moment in Northern Ireland, has adopted the position that it has with regard to its return to the institutions. So as demonstrated in the recent Assembly election, the political dynamics within unionism presented the DUP after a rather bruising year or so internally, with the option to either go hard on the protocol to try and secure its voter base or to risk a very bad election. Electorally, essentially, the party had no option but to take the line that it currently is, that currently did and currently holds. So there's a level of logic, I guess, as to why the party is taking the position it is. But this in turn means that the focus is actually centred on the UK government to take the action that the DUP will consider adequate enough to prompt a return to power sharing. No doubt we will get further into this within the course of the discussion, but certainly the actions of the UK government so far, not least in the form of the protocol bill introduced a few weeks ago, have done, let's say, little to smooth the relations with the EU towards agreeing solutions to the existing issues with the protocol. And as Mary touched upon there, the level of trust between the UK and the EU now is at a very dire point. All of this leads to my second line of thinking around essentially the model of power sharing that we have here in Northern Ireland and the design of the institutions. So the Assembly has met twice since the election, and twice we saw very clearly that the DUP, along with the TUV's one MLA, were on one side of the coin and the remaining parties were on another side. More attention really now, I guess, is being drawn to some of the nuances of how the institutions function as a result, partly of this, but also through some of the attention that, for example, the Alliance Party gained through the election campaign. And now, more than possibly ever since 1998, there is a different type of space opening up for discussion on institutional reform that extends further than the, if I can term it as tinkering around the edges that we've seen in terms of reforms to date. Now, that in itself, as it develops, will all be informed and shaped by the wider political context, both in Westminster and in Dublin. The mere existence of a devolved parliament in Northern Ireland means very different things to different groups here. And of course, as has been touched upon as well, readiness is as important a factor in these conversations as the timing of any such changes or tinkering with the institutional models will be. So none of this conversation can happen without regard to the fact that there are very real, genuine, legitimate concerns out there in some quarters in Northern Ireland that the Brexit arrangements that have been put in place for Northern Ireland in the form of the protocol are altering Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom, changing the nature of that East-West relationship there. And we focus so much on the politics of the situation and so often consider why the politics of the protocol in all of its guises and from all the various perspectives here within Northern Ireland is the way that it is. But fundamentally, and I'll finish on this point, it's the revival of power sharing is more than just about the protocol. Whatever community, it's, you know, whatever background, whatever perspective people have politically with regard to the protocol, fundamentally, it's people here on the ground in Northern Ireland that are impacted by what is going on in the political sphere. A lot of the discourse and the narrative around the protocol and thinking about the institutions here, what the future of power sharing might be, has somewhat overlooked what it actually means for people on the ground. So I think it's important to ensure that that aspect of the wider conversation is taken account of as well. And I'll leave it there.
Right, thank you so much, Claire, for the really important points. And last but not least, we turn to Alan.
Right, thank you, Alan. I think I'm probably going to be the pessimist of this group. As a starting point, we absolutely need to get the Good Friday Agreement institutions back. Internal government, obviously. Also the North-South institutions, which have been blocked for about a year now. The DUP was blocking them even when it was in the executive. Without the institutions, their polarization is growing, and so the longer they're away, the harder they are to get back, and ultimately the harder the agreement settlement is to sustain. And at the moment, there is really no plausible alternative to the agreement as a political framework for Northern Ireland affairs. I do, though, wonder whether the government's approach will really work. It appears to be, we've got to change the protocol because the DUP doesn't like it and won't go back into government otherwise, whatever the views of other parties about the protocol. But if this happens, the DUP will go back into the executive and job done. I'm not sure this is this works entirely. The DUP is an extraordinarily difficult position. It's very hard for it to take anything on trust from the Prime Minister, given the record, and still keep the confidence of its electorate, and doesn't show much sign of doing so. It faces quite possibly existential political risks if the government doesn't ultimately proceed to enact its preferred protocol. People will say you've been led up the garden path by Boris Johnson again, and everybody knows that a reversal of course, however it's portrayed by London, is at some stage quite likely, given the potential impact of a trade war with Europe. And it's certainly impossible to see this bill, more or less impossible to see this bill getting onto the statute book before the October deadline for Assembly elections. On the other hand, it's very difficult also potentially for the DUP to go into further elections. They won a number of seats by narrow margins in the past, and some people will think they really ought to be doing government. They may seek to do that. I wouldn't rule out the possibility they will seek some sort of extension of the deadline that is supposed to run out in October, giving us elections one side or other of Christmas. But potentially, I'd have thought that would be extremely controversial with with the other parties. And we mustn't forget the other parties. They're probably not likely to refuse to go into the executive just because the British government is tearing up its obligations as regards Brussels. There could well be a different approach if matters go further. For example, if the London approach has been hinted at, starts to have an adverse impact in Northern Ireland, undermining the viability of the dairy industry is one thing that's been discussed recently. Or if the government moves to withdraw from the ECHR, or if it uses the bill, as seems to be permissible in its terms, to change the terms of the democratic consent vote on the protocol in 2024. My second point is to ask whether getting the DUP back in is all that's needed to sustain the agreement. Now, I absolutely agree. Picking up something that Julian Smith was saying, we need to get the protocol sorted first. We shouldn't imagine that's the end of the line. That's all that needs to be done to put the agreement institutions back onto a stable footing. They would be extremely fragile. We've had sticking plaster political solutions before. The difficulties with the agreement run much deeper than the protocol dispute. And the executive has appeared to teeter on the brink of collapse for several years until it did finally go. And it may only have been COVID and the electoral unpopularity that would have come with to a party that seemed to be abandoning government during a time like epidemic saved it. Now, there's a lot in my paper about the crumbling underpinnings of the agreement, the dwindling of efforts to promote reconciliation, the growth of sectarianism, the recrudescence of paramilitary influence on politics in the first place, the failure on the part of the executive really to do effective government and public service delivery. So we have, for example, problems in the health service that are very much more acute even than those that are being faced in England now. And then, as Clare was talking about, others were talking about, the institutional structures are increasingly coming under question as well, given changing voting patterns. So I suggest in the paper that we need a process of renewal of the agreement to set it in on firmer foundations. Otherwise, it's really unlikely to last. And the 25th anniversary is the obvious context for that. But it does seem to me that that sort of progress is unlikely to happen without a serious change in the approach of London, which seems to me to be the other crumbling foundation really here. The way London is behaving at the moment is quite at odds with the way the governments of all parties have dealt with Northern Ireland since London sort of learned the lessons about handling Ireland again several decades ago. By those standards, it's irresponsible, and even more so since the Assembly election. And people are, let's be clear, nakedly playing with Northern Ireland's future in pursuit of Brexit objectives and in pursuit of the Conservative leadership. And that has led to a substantial, the government substantially forfeiting trust on all sides in Northern Ireland. The polls suggest that it is massively mistrusted and massively unpopular. And with that has gone the ability to promote compromise. And of course, they've turned their back on the Dublin Partnership, which has been at the heart of political advance in Northern Ireland for decades. Is this just shameless irresponsibility? I mean, it may be Whitehall and Westminster have forgotten a lot of the lessons they learned over the handling of Northern Ireland over a period of decades. I mean, that understanding was never particularly widespread, but there was some, and there was a recognition that it needed sensitive handling, even-handedness responsibility, and that was fundamentally a UK wider interest. And with that went bipartisanship at Westminster. That seems to have gone, and really it does seem to me to be on the critical path to putting matters right. How might matters be put right? I mean, ultimately, it's got to be an inclusive, good faith negotiation, of which we haven't seen very much recently. And ultimately, a negotiation, as I suggested, that maybe staggered about much besides the protocol as well. And I suggested in the paper how we go about developing a process of renewal of the agreement. I was rather naive writing a couple of months ago, I think, about the government's approach to pursuing compromise. Renewal will be difficult. It's not at all a prize there for the taking. It may involve very painful choices. With the political machine stymied, I suggested that there was a civic society role here potentially for putting forward new political ideas, fostering the spirit of compromise, which used to come, as Mary is saying, from the two governments. But that won't be easy either. We've seen recently people outside politics who annoy politicians or activists have a hard time of it. I also suggested it was possible, as part of a renewal package in which Dublin and Brussels were significant partners, it might be easier politically to find an ultimate resolution of the protocol issue and bring other benefits for Northern Ireland. And as Julian Smith was saying, Brussels has always liked to think of itself as a friend of the peace process. And it might be readier to show flexibility to a united lineup of parties and governments who are preparing to start on a new and more promising era of devolved government. But I still find it difficult to see how we get towards agreement of that sort without a significant early change in London's approach. The establishment of a pattern of behaviour that restores the ability of people in Belfast and Dublin and Brussels to trust it. With the best will in the world, that's going to be a hard, long transition. It will be a while before anybody will be willing to regard, in Northern Ireland, willing to regard Northern Ireland as an honest broker again. But if we go on the present course, I think polarisation in Northern Ireland politics will only increase, making it harder to find a workable compromise. The prospects that follow a collapse in the devolution of the sort we had in 2017, I think, are really awful now, much worse than in 2017. There's a chapter in the paper on that. Many people would question the legitimacy of government from London, but somebody is going to have to do government in the post-Brexit context, and there would be enormous rows over Dublin's role. And some see Irish unity as the inevitable outcome, the solution to all of this. Always seemed to me to be very unlikely there will be a vote for unity at any early point. Attitudes are entrenched. The potential disarray of an early unity vote will frighten many people. There's no blueprint available of what a united Ireland might look like. But it does seem to me that the course that London and political unionism are taking at the moment is very doubtful politics from the point of view of the long-term survival of the union. What is happening is liable to alienate many in the middle ground in Northern Ireland, and attitudes are being formed now that, as the new political generation comes to the fore, could well lead to a different constitutional outcome. And that might, with what has been happening recently, happen earlier than expected. None of that would be at all easy or orderly. So I will conclude now. We absolutely need devolved government. We need the institutions back and on a sounder footing. And ultimately, though, I think there is a civic society role. That does come down to the government and its partnership with Dublin. And I think that requires a quite significant change of approach in London. I believe that.
Thank you so much, Alan. Lots to get our teeth into and to be concerned about. Let me remind you that there will be an opportunity very shortly to put questions to the panelists. If you'd like to put a question, then please do put it in the Q&A section here on Zoom, and Conor Kelly will be following those questions and put them to the panel. In the meantime, let's have a little bit of further discussion among the panelists. And I'm very struck that all of you have talked about the importance of trust. And I guess a key question here is, what will generate greater trust? You've talked particularly about concerns over lack of trust in the UK government, but you've also indicated that it's not as though there's an entirely one-sided problem in relation to trust. I wonder if I can go first to Julian on this. Julian, you, as I indicated in my introduction, you have demonstrated that it is possible, even in the Brexit context, for a British Secretary of State to be widely trusted. What are the lessons that we can learn from your experience about how to build trust in Northern Ireland?
Well, I'm very wary about giving advice, so I'll just sort of answer that question slightly different. I'm also interested that 91 has said that this is a predictably biased panel, so I'd be quite interested to know what bias 91 thinks, but I think most people have acknowledged issues of unionism, acknowledge implicitly that everybody could do better and that we just want to get a solution. But if 91 wants to give a bit more clarity, that I think that would be appreciated. I think in terms of trust, I think it's important, probably, Alan, to understand a bit more clearly where everybody's coming from. I guess we've talked about the DUP, but within the Conservative Party, there is obviously a strong group of MPs that are pushing the government to also clarify issues on the protocol, which has led to some of the bill, etc. And I guess that's important because that is sort of a key reason for where we're at. And those colleagues feel very strongly that these issues need to be addressed. And we can debate whether they're right, whether they're wrong, could they do things differently. But I think one of the biggest things in resolving this and developing trust is to fully understand where they're coming from. So there's the DUP, there's the large portion of the Conservative Party, principally driven by the ERG thinking. And then, it is also important to understand where the EU and Ireland are coming from also. And I think this sort of combination of understanding is quite critical. I think there's been quite a lot of sort of deliberate misunderstanding by all of, by many parties, and just trying to get everybody clear on what are everybody's goals, I think is key. I think we've all talked about just spending more time together, more time in a room, more time having conversation. I think the other thing is the only way I see this concluding is through a political negotiation. It's not going to happen with civil servants from the EU or the UK, or that they will be critical in supporting the politicians, but somehow, even the leader to leader work, Macron, Schulz, Johnson, others, Martin, is going to resolve this at the end of the day. And I think then that comes down to what else can the UK offer for more flexibility from the EU on NI, and how can we persuade the EU that actually these flexibilities are worth giving. And that's conversation, but it's quite high level statecraft that is required, I think, to make that happen.
Right, thank you. Mary and then Claire, do you see any kind of practical steps that could be taken in the current context that would help to build trust? Alan has talked quite depressingly about the constraints of the current context and some of the things that seem unlikely to happen in the current context. But do you see things that practically could be done by whichever actors in this process in order to help to build trust? Mary first.
Thanks, Alan. Trust is essentially about relationships, good relationships and honest relationships. And in that context, what's very important, I'm really just going to repeat what Julian said in a way. It is really about dialogue and engagement and understanding, and doing that in a fashion which is honest and open. It's also about, in terms of understanding Northern Ireland, it's about going there, and it's about being there, and it's about engaging on the ground, not just with the political parties, but with civic society as well. I think it's also very important that all of the key actors here are very careful in terms of the language that they use and the sentiments that they express. When it comes to any post-conflict society, there are sensitivities, and language is part of that. So megaphone diplomacy should always be avoided in these scenarios, and we've seen far too much of that, I think, over recent years. And we really do need to be mindful of all of these factors when we try to rebuild and restore trust. But really, it comes down to relationships, to dialogue, to engagement, and to understanding, and they really are the sort of primary key tools via which we can begin to develop and restore a degree of trust between all those involved.
Claire?
Yeah, I think I largely concur with what has already been said by Mary and Julian. I think if there's one thing that I could add, albeit I think it's kind of been touched upon already, is that the only way really forward, and I agree entirely that it's dialogue is the only real way to any sort of solutions on the current issues. The important aspect that needs to be kept in mind with it is that it's not something that can be thought about in terms of silos. So it's not going to be enough just to think about what the UK wants, what the EU wants, what Dublin's interests are, what Belfast's interests are. All of these issues overlap with each other. All of them influence and shape each other, you know, and it is very much through a process of dialogue, active engagement, good faith engagement, not just something that's a tick box exercise that, you know, various sides could come out and say, well, we tried X, Y, and Z, you know, genuine, real engagement around the issues. And as Mary touched upon as well, that very important aspect of Northern Ireland is at the centre of this. You know, I'm based in Northern Ireland currently. You know, you need to be engaging with people on the ground, and indeed we've seen in recent times that the most successful, for want of a better word, approaches that have been seen in terms of getting some forward momentum, both in terms of politics here in Northern Ireland, but also in terms of generating broader understanding around the needs, the concerns, the issues here in Northern Ireland around the protocol, has actually been through engaging with people here. So yeah, just really to reinforce what has been said, and to emphasize that it's not one side that's ever going to be able to bring about these solutions. It's a collaborative effort that's really required for it.
Thank you. One further question from me before we go to audience questions. I think there was a point of disagreement among you as to what the necessary steps are in the short term. And Julian, you very much emphasized that progress is needed on the protocol in the short term. That needs to be the focus until Stormont is restored, and then other matters can receive attention as well. Whereas Clare, I think you were quite strongly arguing that we can't deal just with the protocol in the short term. It's necessary to deal with other matters as well. Alan and Mary, I wasn't quite sure where you stood in that debate. Perhaps you were taking slightly intermediate positions. So could we maybe go to Mary and Alan on that question first, just to understand what your position is on that, and then maybe get some reactions from Julian and Clare. Mary, do you want to go first?
I mean, the protocol is the issue, you know, that really is the blockage in the system right now. So I think there is a need to confront it. You know, there is a majority of unionism has problems, and many of them are legitimate problems around the protocol. So I do think we need to grapple with that issue first and foremost. But that's not to say that in a parallel sense, that there can't be ongoing discussions in Northern Ireland. And in some ways, there is an effort at that through these bi-weekly discussions being chaired by the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service. But the crisis issue is the protocol. And I'm just not, you know, and the opposition to the protocol, we can't wish it away. You know, there may be some of us who disagree with the analysis of what the protocol means and what it's leading to, but we can't wish away the fact that it is a problem for a community in Northern Ireland. And that's not to in any way minimize the fact that the protocol has support amongst nationalism and amongst others in Northern Ireland. But this is the one issue I think that has to be confronted. We shouldn't be holding Northern Ireland hostage to it either, though. You know, I do think there should be some capacity for some parallel processes to be taking place here, so I'm intermediate, like you say, on this particular issue, but I do acknowledge that the protocol is a problem.
Alan?
Yeah, no, I agree that the protocol is the one issue that is preventing the institutions from getting up and running now, and it is better to have institutions than not to have institutions. So it does need to be tackled. But I think it's also important to realize that that is not the only thing that has been going wrong with the agreement. We have had a succession of fragilities. You know, the executive has been on the point of collapse on a number of occasions since about 2014, before Brexit was even thought of. And ultimately, if we are to keep the agreement in being, we need to be addressing all of that quite fundamentally. But the protocol is the first issue. We mustn't pretend it's the only issue.
Okay, Clare?
Thank you. Yes, I didn't realise I perhaps placed myself so diametrically opposed to what Julian had been mentioned. I very much am of the same line of thinking that the question of timeliness and taking account of broader factors is extremely important, particularly so in the context of Northern Ireland and thinking about any sort of upheaval or constitutional rearrangement or institutional reform. But I think probably if we're talking about, the protocol is the issue at the moment. It's the one issue that's holding things up. It's the block that's in place at the moment. And I think if I could perhaps hopefully more articulately express my thinking on what should happen in terms of timing and sort of concurrent processes, I think once the protocol is dealt with, there will need to be a serious set of conversations between the political parties here in Northern Ireland to effectively try and kickstart things again. As things are at the moment, there's two sets of dynamics going on here with the DUP at the centre, and those dynamics are between Northern Ireland and Westminster in terms of the protocol. Once the protocol issue is dealt with, and I'm aware I'm using very simplistic language in that regard, but once that is dealt with, that doesn't mean that the other strand of the dynamic, which is between the parties in Northern Ireland, will automatically be dealt with. So I think as part of that second strand of conversations, it's not just going to be about the modalities of, when do we get back in power, what sort of, who are you thinking of to take such a ministerial portfolio? It's not going to be that sort of more, I guess, mundane level of political conversation. It probably will start to incorporate more around the functioning of the institutions and what will be needed going forward. And I think in particular, and again, I don't want to go down the line of blowing things up in the context of an election happening and all of the narratives and rhetoric that comes with that. But I think in the context of the size of the Alliance Party within the Northern Ireland Assembly currently, I'm not expecting any overnight massive changes, but I do foresee there being at least a different character or nature starting to feed into what those conversations are, given their strength of influence comparatively now within those conversations compared to before the recent election. So I think that it's more of a sequential approach that I think is probably the most likely and the most logical way forward in terms of not just getting things back and running again, but for trying to put in place a framework that is more, I guess, sustainable and robust to be able to deal with the consequences of Brexit and to deal with the future knocks and challenges that will come, all of which will be quite different in the context of Brexit than anything that we saw prior to that. So I hope that kind of makes some sense there.
That's great, thank you. So Julian, it sounds like there's agreement with you on the sequencing and the priority on the protocol initially. Would you say that in the longer term, once if Stormont can be got up and running, the protocol issue can be resolved, again to use that word with caution, do you think there does need to be a serious look at the agreement and a serious think about whether those arrangements need to be revised in order to have stability of the power sharing institutions?
Well, I think there are always arguments to relook at things, and I think that is something, in particular, as you're coming up to a quarter century, it's well worth doing. But I think we talked about stability. I mean, there is and there isn't stability. Is there stability in the Westminster system? Is there stability in France? Is there stability? So, okay, yeah, maybe there isn't great stability in NI, but who are we to judge? I think we've got more women MLAs than in history, more women candidates than we've ever had. We've got a great set of young MLAs. We've had Arlene Foster, we've got Michelle O'Neill, we've got women leaders there, we've got a female head of the civil service. So actually, I think there's a big, good group of people there wanting to govern. And the only thing I think that will keep them focused are voters. And what are voters dealing with? The waiting lists in health have gone up by about 60,000 since I left post 2 years ago, and it was 250,000 then. It's over 300,000 now. When you look at Northern Ireland's population, that is a massive number of people on waiting lists. There are huge cost of living issues. There'll be an upward tension from all of this, particularly as the summer goes on and we get into the autumn. So this protocol needs to be dealt with, and we need to then get them back into power sharing, but also there will be pressures, on them. And I think my only contention is if you start to open up any other issue apart from the protocol, you're going to find you won't get agreement. You need to just herd everybody back in, and longer term, yeah, definitely have a look at it. But you know, I think voters and the desire of politicians to govern, you know, is key. Just on the protocol, I think it is worth acknowledging that, you know, the positives about the protocol, and you know, the fact that Northern Ireland Business wrote to government a couple of weeks ago to state clearly, broadly, its support for the protocol, and as we've alluded to elsewhere, you know, other citizens supporting it. So I think that these multiple strands of the issue, you know, make resolving this even more challenging. You've got the ERG wanting more purity, you've got the DUP sort of wanting to clarify a whole range of issues, you've got business wanting many of the benefits, and that obviously makes this resolution of this particular issue that bit more difficult.
Thank you. We have lots of great audience questions, so let's go to them now. So Conor appears on our screen. And Conor, first round of questions.
Yes, lots of good questions coming in. So the first one is from Adam Goodwin, and he says, to be provocative in an entirely respectful way, was it a mistake not to subject the Northern Ireland Protocol to a referendum of the people of Northern Ireland, given it arguably altered the constitutional position of Northern Ireland? And is there a case that any changes to the protocol should be subject to a vote as a way of resolving the gridlock? The next question is from Fen Woolly-Gale, and she says, I've been struck by the interventions from the USA, and I'm a bit unclear about the precise nature of the relationship of the United States to Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement. Could the panel comment on this relationship and reflect on whether US interventions are likely to be helpful or unhelpful for restoring power sharing, maintaining peace, and stabilizing the current protocol issues? And then finally, a question from Paul O'Diver, who I believe is formerly of the Irish Department of Finance. Does the panel agree that it is an aim of the UK government to force a land border on the island of Ireland, or failing that, force Ireland to withdraw from the single market for goods and anything else that goes with this? My feeling is that the current UK government and the DUP are a malevolent force in this situation.
Very good, thank you. Lots of big and important questions there. No one is obliged to try to answer every question. We should try to get through these and hopefully another round as well. Clare, would you like to go first as the voice of Northern Ireland in this discussion?
No worries, I'll certainly try anyway. So with regard to the first question around a referendum in Northern Ireland on the protocol, I do wonder in just a purely practical sense, you know, what the benefit of that would have been. I think in some ways it might have actually exacerbated some of the tensions that we are seeing now, because, you know, why would Northern Ireland hold a referendum on this particular issue separate to what might be happening in Great Britain? That just further exacerbates the dynamics we're seeing currently in terms of Northern Ireland being differentiated in some way. That's if I've understood the question correctly about it being a Northern Ireland specific type of referendum. If we're talking about protocol changes and I guess Northern Irish input into any of that, it's absolutely essential. As has been touched upon already in the discussion, it's not pretty close to pointless to be doing anything regarding Northern Ireland without involving Northern Ireland and Northern Irish businesses, politicians, people from right across various sectors in Northern Ireland in terms of sharing their experiences, their own needs, their own wants with regard to how those post-Brexit arrangements need and should work on the ground from their perspectives, and feeding all of that together to create a holistic approach will be absolutely essential going forward. So not so much in terms of you know, a hard and fast, I guess, type of referendum to people, you know, to come out and vote, do you accept change X, Y, or Z to the protocol? Ultimately, we're looking at the involvement of people in Northern Ireland in terms of informing those conversations, albeit that the formal routes for input are somewhat limited in terms of Northern Ireland's input with regard to being able to enact or bring about changes to the protocol, but certainly the voices have been screaming very loudly and making their impact heard. So that all needs to be taken into account there. In terms of international relations, there has been a degree of skepticism, let's say, in certain quarters here with regard to US interventions in debates on the protocol, certainly for some of the unionist parties. The voices coming from the United States so far that have been very pro-protocol, very much saying, you know, that the protocol needs to be kept in place, you know, very much, I guess, peddling the Irish perspective, if I can put it that way, you know, very much in favour of it. That kind of narrative hasn't landed easily with unionist politicians in particular here. So I guess, and it's very different now compared to some of the previous instances where we saw US intervention and engagement with regard to the peace process here in Northern Ireland. I think now there's a very clear distinction in terms of how that sort of intervention is being received. So it's one of those things that I guess it'll have to play out, but by and large, the voices coming from America have been, I guess if you take the debate in Northern Ireland as being two-sided, they've been quite one-sided. And the final point then...
Just very quickly.
Very quickly, with regard to the, you know, what are the motivations? Is it a border in the island of Ireland, or is it to try and get Ireland to leave the EU? I don't think either of those are palatable options on any side. I don't think even the UK is in any way practically minded towards that, because they're very acutely aware of the issues that it would give rise to in Northern Ireland. What exactly the solution is that they're proposing or wanting to achieve, I'm not sure, because there's so many overlapping elements, and it really isn't clear what clear direct way that they actually want to proceed with things going forward. So that's boiling down a lot into a very short couple of sentences there in the last one, so I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Alan, you were involved in the peace process for several decades and saw the role of the US in that. Does that give you a different perspective from Clare's on that question?
Yeah, the US has made a considerable contribution down the years to the formation of the agreement, to keeping the agreement going. You know, George Mitchell's, he faced substantial unionist resistance when he first showed up, but he managed to overcome it, and he played a crucial role along with the two governments in getting us towards the agreement. And other US players subsequently have made significant efforts. Richard Haas, for example, who had been a Republican-appointed State Department official, though by then was chair of the Council on Foreign Relations, was invited back by all the Assembly Party, all the executive parties in about 2013 to do a big review, and again, I think was well respected. It's a bit more difficult now. Everything is more polarized. And that includes, I think, US opinion as regards Northern Ireland. And whereas unionism in the past made some efforts to get its side of the story understood, I mean, there's a much readier audience for the nationalist side of the story, obviously, in America. Unionism made efforts in the past to get its story understood. I think it has eased off on that, though Doug Beattie was there before the protocol issues got really hot, attempting to do that. But I think, you know, the people who we've seen recently simply saying, what has this got to do with America, are really being rather unhistorical. Is there a plot by anybody in Northern Ireland or in the rest of the UK to force a land border in the island of Ireland? I don't know what's in people's minds. There is a suspicion around that, and you know, one of the many suspicions that happen when you don't have open dialogue, I suppose, that is what is on the agenda. You do hear unionists, the unionist ultras occasionally, I think the ERG ultras occasionally saying, well, we'll get rid of the protocol if the Irish, if the Europeans decide then there then has to be a land border. Well, that'll be up to them, won't it? Now, you know, the political consequences of that are potentially extremely significant. And you know, that sort of language does lead people to think that there are quite malign motivations in some of this.
Mary, do you want to give us a perspective from south of the border on that question?
Yeah, I do actually. To be frank, on that last question in relation to trying to push Ireland out of the single European market, I mean, there's no other way to interpret such a move were it to happen as anything other than an unfriendly act of very, very serious proportions. The consequences of such a move would completely undermine British-Irish relations and any level of trust that might currently exist between the two administrations. I mean, it's also likely that it would have a very profound impact on the ground in the Republic of Ireland in terms of how society would respond to such a move. And it's likely that it would propel moves towards pressure for a border poll. And I think, whereas right now, I don't think you might necessarily muster support for United Ireland. I think against that particular backdrop, that would be a game changer in terms of how people might respond to a border poll. So on that question, I would take a very dim view of any British government action in that regard. I'll just briefly go to the first question, if I may, Alan.
Just very quickly, yep.
Yeah, on the issue of a referendum on the protocol in Northern Ireland, that question alludes to the fact that the protocol has changed Northern Ireland's constitutional position, and I just want to confront that and disagree with it. Northern Ireland's constitutional position has not been changed. Northern Ireland remains a part of the United Kingdom, and Northern Ireland's constitutional position will remain unchanged until such time as a referendum is called by the Secretary of State and a referendum is passed north and south of the border. So if there were to be a referendum on the protocol, you know, the argument would likely be that the referendum result on the Brexit referendum should hold equal weight. So I'm not persuaded by that.
Yes, there was a comment in the chat that didn't go to all people on the call from Philip Whitford, SNP MP, who pointed out that talk about a referendum on protocol highlights the fact that in the Brexit referendum, Northern Ireland voters voted to remain. So there are different perspectives on that issue. Julian, do you want to come in quickly on any of those questions?
On the issue of the vote, there is a consent mechanism we've all talked about, and that's why we've got to deal with the changes of the protocol very sensitively. The MLAs who were voted in March, their job is to vote on this consent mechanism. So let's not forget, actually, if people decide they don't want the protocol, those MLAs can vote that way. That is the most efficient route to make a definitive decision on the protocol, and that's why we must be very careful on any changes that people were elected on the basis of that vote. I think in terms of the USA, I mean, it's complex. We've obviously got three main strands of activity. We saw congressmen, and I don't think women, but potentially women coming across recently. I think they're going to do what they're going to do, and we've obviously got to remember at this end that they will have votes on things like trade deals, so they are influential in that regard. The White House obviously will conduct what it wants to conduct, and then the State Department. And the State Department, in my view, has always played a very useful and proactive role in Northern Ireland. It was very helpful when I was there. And is being very helpful now, and I suspect that they want to try to achieve the things we want to achieve and get negotiations, and are probably actively helping to try to encourage that. On the issue of borders, look, I mean, I fought and colleagues fought very hard to make sure that there was no change during the Brexit period to any element of the situation on the island of Ireland. I think that will continue to be the case. Obviously, that comes against challenges when you have the desire to potentially move away, those who argue for protocol removal, obviously then end up with a challenge in that regard. But I think the idea that we're returning to any border, would be very unlikely to get any traction here.
Thank you. We have 4 minutes left. Let's try to get a very quick set of further questions and very quick responses to them. Conor.
Yes. So a question from Brian Walker. A late autumn election looks likely. Will it further harden polarization or create positive agenda for a return to power sharing? If the former, how can a period of direct rule be avoided as the least worst option? Could Dublin prevent it? Then two anonymous questions. One is, if a Sinn Féin-led government is returned in Dublin in the coming years, how will that affect the dynamics of the protocol debate? And then finally, how willing is the UK and the EU to create new structures or mechanisms for Northern Irish voices to be more directly involved in what is a reserved matter? Does the UK government direction of more centralised power and less devolution and the EU sensitivities about subnational movements mean this is not an option?
Wonderful, thank you. I'm afraid each of our speakers has 1 minute to respond to such questions there as you would like to respond to, and also offer any concluding comments if you would like to offer a few concluding words. Mary, I think you've got the hardest task here because 2 of those questions were very much questions for you, I think. Do you want to give it a go?
Sure. Well, will I go with the Sinn Féin government in Dublin question on the protocol? I mean, you need to look at Sinn Féin's position on the protocol, and Sinn Féin supports the implementation of the protocol. You know, Sinn Féin supports there being an open border on the island of Ireland. In many ways, Sinn Féin is effectively supporting the status quo in terms of what we have. Now, if they are in government in Dublin, and that may happen in the not too distant future, I don't necessarily foresee that position on the protocol changing. And I think Sinn Féin will take its lead from Northern Ireland and from the operation of the consent mechanism in 2024 in the Northern Ireland Assembly. So a Sinn Féin government in Dublin isn't necessarily a game changer, I think, in terms of losing or revising the protocol.
Very interesting, thank you. Alan.
Yes, the prospect of an election in the autumn. Which of us has any idea? The collapse of negotiation, calling an election in the autumn, it would be one side or other of Christmas. I suspect that the DUP would go into it conscious of the threat from its right from the TUV in a very gung-ho manner, last chance to restore a unionist First Minister. That might all be further polarizing. But what the results would be, I mean, whether there will be an increase, a further increase in the size of the centre ground, I don't know. If the conclusion is reached, as the questioner was hinting at, that really devolved government was not possible after that, then I think, as I said, we're in an extremely difficult position. I think straightforward direct rule would be absolutely not accepted by a large part of the population. And the role that the Irish government would have in that context through the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference would be capable of being fairly explosive as well. And, you know, political vacuums have always, throughout Northern Ireland, you know, the last number of decades, been regarded as extremely dangerous in Northern Ireland. They leave room for other people to come into the centre of the arena, and I think that would be an acute danger here as well.
Thank you very much. Clare.
Thank you. Yes, I was going to pick up on the election question as well. Essentially, if we're going into another Assembly election before the end of this year, at the start of next year, it will be extremely divisive here, not only in terms of the, I guess, extreme positions that it would push people to, very much centering around that First and Deputy First Minister question, particularly for the DUP and wanting to reclaim that. But also, I think it's fair to say at this stage that people in Northern Ireland are just sick of constantly being taken back to the polls to re-elect people back into office in Stormont. At this stage, they just want to see governance happen. Now, that said, there is some support for the position that the DUP is taking on the protocol. That is entirely fair to say. But the majority of people in Northern Ireland are of the mind that we need the devolved institutions to be working again, and another election will not go in any way to fulfilling public confidence in those institutions or indeed the elected representatives within them.
Thank you, Clare. Last word to Julian Smith.
So just on the election, I wouldn't hold your breath on the UK government ultimately granting an election. So I think at the end of the day, and there is a theory, obviously, that you know, of how the unionist vote might consolidate or whatever. But I think we may find that that there is no election. I think the most important thing is that you know, these talks and these changes on the protocol move forward. On Sinn Féin, I'm not going to comment on you know, foreign governments political hue, but what I would say is how unionism manages the coming months and years is vital. Those middle ground voters that we see becoming stronger in Northern Ireland are absolutely key to retaining the union. So we do need to keep a focus on those. And then directly involving Northern Ireland voices here. Well, we've got DUP MPs, we've got SDLP MPs, and we've got an Alliance MP, and obviously the Sinn Féin MPs who don't take their seats. I think it is really important that Number 10 government are regularly meeting with all of the major parties in Northern Ireland. We've obviously had the confidence and supply period during the May years. We need to just make sure all of those voices are heard here, and that we balance all of the different needs, the unionist issues that we need to solve, and then the focus of the other parties. But I'd conclude by saying, as other speakers have alluded to, ultimately Northern Ireland has to be the focus of people's thinking on this. We've got various equities, various interests, but voters in Northern Ireland want to be governed, and they want a situation in the relationship with Europe which works, and is ultimately where jobs come in. Northern Ireland is performing amongst the best economy in the United Kingdom at the moment. Part of that is because of the protocol. Part of it is obviously through other reasons. But we need to make sure Northern Ireland, when people are debating these issues, is front and centre of their mind.
Thank you so much, Julian. And thank you to you all for being a fantastic panel here. Julian Smith, Mary Murphy, Alan Weissel, and Clare Rice. You've been thoroughly thought-provoking and interesting. And I hope the fact of holding a panel on Northern Ireland as part of the Constitution Unit's conference on the Constitution of the UK as a whole reminds us just how important these debates are, and reminds a London audience, to think seriously about Northern Ireland and look on Northern Ireland as an end in itself, not just a means to some further ends. This has been the last session of today. Or before I say that, I should say that the recording of this session will be available on our podcast and YouTube channel very soon, and we'll alert you when it is. So this has been the final panel of today, the first day of our conference on the state of the Constitution. We will be back tomorrow morning for a full day of events. First up at 9:15, early morning, we will be looking at the future of the Union and the Constitution. And you'll be able to join that by using the same Zoom link as you have used for today. So thank you so much for your attention today, and we hope to see you back here early tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.